Hello everyone, Shine here from the Phyrexian Arena. Today, we're going to be talking about an upgrade for one of the new Duskmorn Precons. The deck we'll be focusing on today is Miracle Worker. Let's jump right into it. So our plan is to affordably upgrade the Precon within the budget parameters of $75 US. We'll be taking out cards that I don't think fit well, or just simply underperform. The ultimate goal of this deck is to cast enchantments off the top of our library every turn, including our opponent's turns. Now that we know what the plan is, let's talk about how this deck looks out of the box. This deck has 11 pieces of ramp, 8 pieces of card advantage, which is a little low for a deck of this nature, 10 pieces of interaction, and 2 board wipes, which is pretty much perfect, 37 lands, which is my sweet spot, 5 miracle cards, 10 top deck manipulation cards, 25 enchantments, which is a little bit low, and 17 enchantment matters cards, which is perfectly fine. Now let's take a deeper dive into the commander we're going to be using here. MISTOOK Veil Piercer is a 4 mana 2/4 that costs 1 white, blue, black. Her text reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, you surveil 2. Look at the top 2 cards of your library. You may choose to put them in your graveyard, or keep them at the top. She also says, each enchantment in your hand has Miracle. Its miracle cost is equal to its own mana cost, reduced by 4 generic mana. To the naked eye, this just means all of your enchantments cost 4 less, which is not true. Miracle is a keyword that says if it's the first card you draw in a turn, any turn, you may cast it at instant speed for its miracle cost. However, you can only cast it before you actually put it into your hand and move on with your turn. So it has to be the first thing you cast as you draw it. Obviously, this commander seems very powerful. However, out of the box, the deck plays very clunky. It has almost no early game and pretty much folds if its commander is killed or countered. The problem is you have too many 7 to 10 cost enchantments in your hand. You'll find yourself being attacked early game because of how scary MISTOOK is. So what we want to do is we want to give ourselves early game protection as well as allow us to manipulate the top of our library and draw cards on other people's. That way we can miracle out our enchantments and cause a really, really big problem for our opponents. In my opinion, here are the best cards in the deck out of the box. Shark Typhoon. This can represent a lethal threat, especially with how expensive our enchantments are. This is especially good because it creates flying threats, and flying threats are much harder to deal with. Next up is Sigil of the Empty Throne. This is another win condition that's very similar to Shark Typhoon. The only difference here is that this one makes threats that are a little bit less big, but they're still flying, so you can still win a game with this. Next up is Hall of Heliod's Generosity. This is a staple card in all enchantment decks, and I'm so happy to see that they reprinted it. This is both recursion and top deck manipulation, which is both things that we want to do specifically for enchantments. Next up is ONDU Spirit Dancer. This is a great source of card advantage. They only printed it twice, and this is the second printing of this card, and this card should be in every single enchantment deck. It allows us to draw cards each time we play an enchantment, and wouldn't you know it, there's a lot of enchantments in this deck. Last but certainly not least is Sphere of Safety. This is a protection card that, with the right board state, can pretty much make you protected from everything. The downside of this card is its mana cost, but if you're playing the deck upgraded the way we're going to do it today, this card is going to stay in the deck and perform very, very well. Finally, this is our weapon of choice. This is our favorite card in the deck, and that card is Ink Shield. This is a 5 mana instant that says prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to you. For each 1 damage prevented this way, create a 2/1 white and black Inkling creature token with flying. This is both protection from damage as well as a great win condition for defensive decks like this one. It's awesome to see this card being reprinted because it was really reaching up there in price, and finally now it just comes in a pre-constructed deck. Now let's talk about some cards that have to go. These are cards that underperform and just simply don't belong in the deck. Aminatu's Augury. Although this card is very flavorful and powerful, unfortunately the mana cost is too high. Due to it not being an enchantment, and our commander not giving sorceries Miracle, this card just doesn't really fit very well with the deck. Next is Auramancer. Inherently, this card is not bad, and if this card had put something from your graveyard to the top of your library, I probably would have kept it. However, after testing the deck out, this card just simply underperformed. Cramped Vents or Access Mage. This room just feels a little bit weak, and if you want to keep it in deck you can, but I personally cut it from mine. Dream Eater. In theory, this card is very powerful. It's a 6 mana 4/3 with flying and flash that bounces something and allows you to manipulate at the top of your library. The problem lies in its mana cost. It's really expensive, 6 mana for a bounce spell. This deck is already pretty slow, and this card makes it even slower. Now, had this been an enchantment, this would have been a different story, because this is a very good card in its own right. Next up is Bottomless Pool and Locker Room. This room is probably the weakest room in the entire set. Locker Room has its uses, however, it's hard to justify putting this card in over any other enchantment. Next up is Life Insurance. This card is really good, however, it doesn't really fit with the deck. Our deck doesn't really want to kill its own creatures, nor does it really kill anything in general, so this card just feels like a dead drop. Next is Athreos Shroud Veiled. This card is great, but our deck doesn't really have enough creatures to justify running it, so this kind of feels like another dead drop. I would take this card out and probably put it in a different deck like an Aristocrats themed deck, but it definitely doesn't belong in this deck. Return to Dust is a good card, but it's a little bit expensive, and unless you're going to cast it on your main phase, this card just isn't really worth it. There's a lot better removal in these colors. Next up is Brainstone. This is a bit of a slow way to manipulate the top of your library, and it requires you to sacrifice this thing, so it's a one-off. This card's just not worth it. Remove it. Next up is the Master of Keys, and let me preface this by saying I don't think that this card is bad at all. I simply think that this card would be way better in its own deck. So save this card and build a deck out of it, but don't keep it in this one. Now that we've spoken about what cards to take out of this deck, let's talk about what to put in. First up is Thassa, God of the Sea. This is both an enchantment creature as well as a way to manipulate the top of your library before you draw on your turn. Archon of Sun's Grace is very similar to both Shark Typhoon as well as Sigil of the Empty Throne. It itself is a flying threat, and it creates other flying threats whenever an enchantment is played. Those flying threats that it creates have lifelink when this is on the battlefield, which means that it'll give you some life gain. Path to Exile is a white staple removal spell that should be in every white deck. In fact, I'm surprised it wasn't in the pre-constructed deck. It's a 1 mana creature removal spell. Can't get better than that. Propaganda will help you get around that lack of protection early game that this deck has. Most of the time, your opponents are not going to want to pay 2 per creature if they attack you, so they're just not going to do it. While we're at it, we might as well double up on the protection early game by adding Ghostly Prison. This does the same thing as Propaganda. If you have both out at the same time, your opponent's going to have to pay 4 per creature to attack you, and they're not going to do that. Next up is a pretty weird and unique card. It's Penance. This card doesn't really see a lot of play, but in this deck specifically, it's really, really powerful. This is a 3 mana enchantment that allows you to put cards onto the top of your library at instant speed from your hand. This allows you to do some pretty cool stuff with your commander. It essentially says if you have an expensive enchantment in your hand, you can cast it for 4 less if your commander's on the battlefield. And with some of the other cards that I've included on this upgrade list, it combos really, really well. And hey, it even gives you protection from 2 colors. Next up is Insight. This card draws you a card every time an opponent plays a green spell. Now sure, this is pretty niche and relies on somebody to be playing green, but most pods, somebody has at least 1 person playing green, so you're going to benefit from this pretty easily. Next up is arguably the most powerful enchantment in all of Magic the Gathering. That is Omniscience. This allows you to play spells from your hand without paying their mana cost, so essentially you just play all cards from your hand for free. If you have cards on the battlefield that draw you cards when you play an enchantment, this card can go almost infinite, but that requires some setup and luck, so for all intents and purposes, this is just an enchantment that allows you to cast things for free from your hand. It's also 10 mana, so if you have Shark Typhoon out, that's a big 10/10 flyer. Next up is Ledger Shredder. This is one of my favorite cards in Magic right now. There's a reason it's $16 right now. So essentially what it does is every time a player casts their second spell each turn, this creature connives. Meaning, you draw a card, and then you discard a card. If you discard a non-land card, then this creature gets a +1/+1 counter. Now I hear you saying, why is this powerful in this deck? It's not an enchantment, it doesn't really benefit. Well, it does, because it allows you to draw cards on other people's turns. And like I said in the beginning of the video, miracle cards can be casted at instant speed, meaning they can be casted on your opponent's turns. This is a way to draw cards on your opponent's turn, which is also a way to cast miracle spells on your opponent's turn. Because miracle is a keyword that says, if this is the first card you draw on any turn, you can cast it for its miracle cost. Any turn, including your opponent's turns, at instant speed. Not to mention, if this card gets big enough, it can be a threat too. Last but not least, is the most expensive card on this list, and also one of my favorite cards in Magic's history. Sensei's Divining Top is a 1-mana artifact that allows you to both manipulate the top of your library, as well as draw cards at instant speed. Once again, including your opponent's turns. Every deck that cares about the top of its library runs this card because it's just so incredibly good. That brings us to $74, which is $1 below our goal of $75. I hope this video helped you upgrade this deck. Aminatou is an extremely powerful commander when built right. I tested this deck before and after the upgrades were added, and the deck performed drastically better with the upgrades than it did before. If you use this video to upgrade this deck, please let me know how it performed for you. Thank you for watching.